People ask me why I stayed in the backcountry after everything that happened. I tell them the commute is good. They laugh because they think I'm joking. I'm not joking. The drive into Colleton County takes 40 minutes on a good morning. 40 minutes of pine flatland and red dirt and the kind of sky that doesn't apologize for being big. I need that drive. I need the quiet before I see the lab, what's left of it. And I need the 40 minutes back in the evening to put the day away before I talk to anyone who might ask me a sensible question. After everything, the drive is about the only thing that still makes sense to me in the way things used to make sense, which is to say simply, and without argument. My name is Martin Haas. I was an engineer. I say was not because I stopped, but because the word engineer stopped fitting what I do now. What I do now doesn't have a clean name yet. Maybe it never will. This is the account of 18 days in October. I've given versions of it to 4 different federal offices, 2 university research panels, and 1 Senate subcommittee that swore up and down its proceedings were classified but whose summary report I found posted on an amateur astronomy forum 3 weeks later. I've given the official version, the sanitized version, and the version I gave my daughter Jessie when she was old enough to hear it. This is the version I haven't given anyone yet. The full one. The one where I admit how frightened I was, how many times I nearly quit, and what I actually said the night it ended. Tom and I had been working on the Haas-Dillingham reactor for 6 years. That name sounds grander than it was. The facility was a converted agricultural research station 12 miles outside of Walterboro. 3 prefab buildings bolted together at the joints, a parking lot that flooded every time it rained above a drizzle, and enough second-hand equipment to stock a very confused museum. Tom Dillingham had done 3 tours as a Navy electrical systems technician before getting his engineering degree at 41, and he brought that same combination of practical ingenuity and catastrophic impatience to everything we built. I had the theoretical background. Tom had the hands. Between the two of us, we had what a generous person might call one decent engineer. The reactor was in theory an infinite power source. That phrase sounds like science fiction, and in the wrong mouths it is, but what we were actually chasing was a specific resonance phenomenon, a self-sustaining electromagnetic feedback loop that, if you got the geometry exactly right and the field harmonics to within about 3 decimal places, would generate more output energy than it consumed by drawing on quantum-scale vacuum fluctuations. The math worked. The simulations worked. We had run 14 successful small-scale tests and published 2 papers that the mainstream journals sent back with polite rejections, and the fringe journals accepted with embarrassing enthusiasm. We were not crackpots. We were just broke, understaffed, and working in a building that still smelled like hog feed. The 15th test was Tom's idea, and I went along with it because Tom's ideas had a way of being right about 60% of the time, and I'd started trusting those odds more than I should have. We were behind on the lease. We had no new funding in the pipeline. The investor group that had been circling us for 8 months, a consortium connected to a man named Berube, who made his money in petroleum extraction and spent it trying to own anything that might threaten petroleum extraction, had made its 3rd and final offer the week before, and we had turned it down because accepting it would have meant signing over exclusive licensing rights and watching everything we'd built get locked in a drawer. So we ran the test early. We didn't have the tertiary containment array finished. We didn't have the external shielding calibrated past 80%. Tom said it would be fine. I said it would probably be fine. Neither of us wrote that down anywhere, which tells you what we actually believed. The test ran for 11 seconds before the harmonic resonance hit a frequency we hadn't predicted. The feedback loop climbed past our suppression threshold in about 4 of those 11 seconds, and then the primary chamber went critical, and the whole east wing of the facility ceased to exist in any meaningful structural sense. I woke up in a ditch 40 feet from the building, with my left ear ringing and Tom standing over me, covered in insulation foam from the fire suppression system, which had deployed about 2 seconds too late to help anything. The building was on fire. The parking lot was on fire. Tom's eyebrows were singed off, and he had the expression of a man doing rapid internal calculations about whether to be relieved or furious. Output was off the charts, he said, before it blew. The building is on fire, Tom. I know the building is on fire. He helped me up. The readings, though, Martin, the readings. We stood there in the red dirt and watched 6 years of work burn. I was thinking about Jesse, who was 16 and whose college fund had gone into the tertiary containment array we hadn't finished. I was thinking about Mary Lou, who had left 2 years before, and who would hear about this somehow and feel vindicated in a way that would be completely fair. I was thinking that I was 44 years old and had just destroyed the one thing I'd built that actually worked, in the very moment that it worked. I wasn't thinking about what the energy pulse had done when it left the atmosphere. I didn't find out about that for 9 days. The first 7 of those 9 days were logistics, insurance adjusters, county inspectors, the kind of phone calls where the person on the other end speaks in a tone of careful professional neutrality that means they are deciding how much trouble you're in. Tom handled most of that. He was better at it. I drove out to the site every morning and stood in the ruins and tried to figure out what the readings had actually shown before the chamber blew, working from memory because every hard drive in the facility had been either destroyed or fused into something that looked like modern sculpture. On the 8th day, I started having the dream. It wasn't a dream the way dreams usually are, fragmented, irrational on the moment you open your eyes. It was precise. It was a location. Red clay soil, a stand of loblolly pine, a dry creek bed with a particular bend in it. I knew that bend. I'd fished a creek like that as a boy. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of the trees, and something was pulling at my sternum like a fishhook made of sound. And I woke up both times with my heart hammering and an absolute conviction that I needed to go somewhere. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the concussion I'd probably taken when I landed in the ditch, never formally diagnosed because I hadn't seen a doctor. I drove the 40 minutes in, stood in the ruins for 3 hours, drove the 40 minutes back, and had the dream again that night with enough clarity that I could see the specific way the light came through the pine canopy at what looked like late afternoon. On the 9th day, I drove east instead of west, and I didn't entirely know why. I want to be honest about that part. I've seen the account where I'm described as following intuition, and the account where I'm described as responding to a distress signal of unknown type, and both of those make me sound like someone who had a plan. I didn't have a plan. I drove east on 64 because something in my chest said east, and I had run out of arguments against it. I turned off on a logging road I'd never used before because something said turn. I parked where the road ended and walked into the tree line because there was nowhere else to go, and the pulling in my chest had become almost a physical sensation, not painful but insistent, the way a hand on your shoulder is insistent. The creek bed was exactly as I'd seen it. The bend was exact. He was in the drainage hollow on the far side, and I will tell you what I saw because I think the careful language of the official reports does a disservice to the reality of that first moment. He was large, not enormous, but large, the way a man who is 6'4" is large, occupying space with a density that you register before you register anything else. His proportions were wrong for a human being in a way that took me several seconds to identify. The skull was too wide and too deep, giving his head a slightly elongated quality, and his limbs were jointed in ways that resolved into sense only if you stopped expecting them to make human sense. His skin, if skin is the right word, was a dull gray-green, and where the light hit it at certain angles there was a faint iridescence, like oil on still water. His eyes were set wide and deep, and they were the color of something I don't have a word for, somewhere in the territory between amber and gold, but with a depth behind them that made amber and gold seem like shallow descriptions. He had 5 fingers on each hand. That was one of the first things I noticed. 5 fingers, and the 2 outer ones were longer than a human's would be, and all of them were long, and they were holding a piece of equipment about the size and general shape of a car battery, but clearly not a car battery, and he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he spoke, and the speaking wasn't sound. It arrived in my head the way a memory arrives, already present, already in the right language, already meaning something. It wasn't words exactly, but it resolved into words the way music resolves into a melody. The meaning came first and the words formed around it, and what the words formed into was something like, "You are the source." "The source," I said out loud. My voice came out steady. I was surprised by that. The meaning arrived again. The energy, the pulse, your device. The reactor, I understood then. Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the October air. The pulse hit your ship. Not a ship, a survey vessel. The distinction mattered to him. I felt it matter the way you feel someone wince. Survey, measurement, not military, not hostile. You crashed. The vessel came down 12 kilometers from here. The vessel is not recoverable. I am. But I require the components to build a transit beacon, and I require them within. The number he gave me wasn't in any unit I recognized, but the feeling attached to it was unambiguous. A shrinking window, a door closing. How long do I have? 9 of your days. I stood at the edge of a creek bed in rural South Carolina on a Tuesday afternoon and had the following thought, which I will report accurately. I blew up his ride home, and now I have to fix it. "What do you need?" I said. He showed me a list. Not a written list, a sequence of technical specifications that arrived in my mind with the clarity of something I designed myself. Electromagnetic coil arrays, specific capacitance values, a particular crystalline lattice structure that I recognized immediately because we had used a variant of it in the reactor's resonance chamber. Processing units, power cells. A framework that could hold all of it in precise geometric relationship for long enough to generate a sustained tight beam transmission. It was, I realized slowly, not entirely different from what Tom and I had been building. Different application, different scale, different intended output, but the underlying physics was the same physics. The resonance principle was the same principle. I can get most of this, I said. I was already running inventory in my head. What had survived the fire, what we'd had in off-site storage, what I could source without triggering questions I didn't want to answer. Some of it I'll have to fabricate. How long? 7 days if nothing goes wrong. I paused. Things usually go wrong. He looked at me, that amber gold gaze that I was already starting to read. Not well, but a little. And I felt something that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere between them. I told him my name, Martin Haas. He gave me something back that wasn't a name in any human sense. It was more like a designation, a call sign, a point of reference. But the closest I could get it in English was something like an auditory signature, and the closest that came to a name was Cabe. So that's what I called him. I drove back through the pine flatlands with the radio off and my hands steady on the wheel, and the kind of clarity that comes, sometimes, after a very bad decision that you know you're going to follow through on anyway. I called Tom from the driveway. "I need you to come out to the storage unit tomorrow," I said. "The one on Bell's Highway." "Yeah." "Martin is everything." "Everything's fine. I just need help moving some equipment." There was a pause. Tom Dillingham had known me for 11 years, and in 11 years he had learned to read the specific frequency of fine that meant the opposite of fine. "What kind of equipment?" he said. "The kind we built. Tom, will you come?" Another pause. "What time?" he said, not a question. I didn't tell him the rest of it that night. I told him in the morning in the parking lot of the storage unit because I needed to see his face when I said it and I needed the open air around us. I told him everything. The dream, the creek, Cabe, the specifications. Tom listened with his arms crossed and his singed-off eyebrows furrowed. They were growing back by then, uneven, and when I finished he said, "How do you know it's not a trap?" "A trap for what? We don't have anything left to take." "Berub's people might want you out of the picture. They might have set something up." "Tom, it's not Berub's people." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He thought about it. He uncrossed his arms and crossed them again in a different configuration, which was what he did when he was rearranging his mind around a new fact. "The beacon specs," he said. "You said they matched our resonance work." "Close enough that I recognized them." "So he's using the same physics." "Near enough." "That's interesting," Tom said. "Yes. That's genuinely, scientifically interesting." "I know, Tom." "Okay," he said. He turned toward the storage unit door. "What do we need first?" "I want to tell you that the next 6 days went smoothly, and I cannot tell you that because it would be a lie. 2 of the coil arrays from storage were warped from heat damage we hadn't caught in the post-fire assessment. The building's collapse had transferred stress through the shelving, and we hadn't checked carefully enough. We discovered this on the first morning, standing in the storage unit with a flashlight and a straightedge. And Tom said a word I won't repeat, and then immediately got to work figuring out if the warp could be corrected, or if we needed to fabricate new arrays from component stock. It could be partially corrected, with about 4 hours of careful work and a vice press we borrowed from a machinist in Walterboro whose name I will not record here because he asked no questions, and deserved to keep it that way. The corrected arrays would be at 87% of ideal geometry, which I thought wasn't good enough. And Cabe, when I described the deficiency to him that evening, considered it for a long moment. "It will function," he said, "at reduced efficiency. The window of transmission will be shorter." "How much shorter?" "From approximately 40 seconds to approximately 14. I thought about that. "We'll make 14 work," I said. Tom, who was sitting on a log eating a gas station sandwich and listening to a conversation happening inside someone else's head, waited until I turned to him and then raised an eyebrow. 14 seconds, I told him. He finished chewing. "That's fine," he said. 14 is fine." The crystalline lattice assembly was the hardest part. Cabe's specifications called for a geometry we'd never fabricated at that size, and we had to build a jig from scratch to hold the components in alignment while we worked. Tom burned his hand on the 3rd day when a coupling failed and vented hot plasma against his palm, a 2nd-degree burn across 2 fingers that he wrapped himself and did not mention again. We drove out to the creek bed every morning. Cabe could not help with the fabrication. His biology wasn't suited to the fine motor work our components required, and beyond that, he was weakening. I didn't understand why until the 4th day, when I asked him directly, and the answer arrived with the particular weight of something he had been withholding. His atmosphere requirement wasn't exactly ours. The nitrogen-oxygen mix was close enough to sustain him at reduced efficiency, he'd told me, but the specific trace element ratios were wrong, and his body was compensating in ways that cost it. He was burning reserves to breathe our air. Every day we spent building the beacon was a day his margin narrowed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "It would have created urgency that interferes with precision," he said. "Hurried work fails. I know your species' relationship to pressure." "Do you?" "I have been conducting deep surveys for 11 of what you would call decades," he said. "I have observed many species manage deadlines." "How do we rank?" "You are in the top quartile for functional performance under crisis. You are in the bottom quartile for emotional regulation during the same crisis. The 2 facts appear to be related." "That's a diplomatic way to say we panic well." "I would not call it diplomacy. I would call it an accurate assessment. I went back to work. Berub's men showed up on the 5th day. I say Berub's people, and I mean 3 of them in a black SUV that came down the logging road at 8 in the morning, while Tom and I were carrying coil assemblies through the tree line. They were not dressed like field workers. They had the kind of confident ease of men who are accustomed to being the ones doing the arriving, who have never had to think very hard about whether they belong somewhere because they have always had the kind of employer who makes belonging a function of payment. The one who did the talking, a man named Freddie, he told me, like that was sufficient, had the particular smile of someone who already knows how the conversation ends and is performing courtesy as a formality before the conclusion. "Mr. Haas," he said, "didn't expect to see you out this way. Heard about the facility, real shame." "It was," I said. Tom was standing slightly behind me and slightly to my right, which was where Tom stood when he wanted to be close enough to do something if something needed doing. He had a coil assembly under one arm and the expression of a man waiting for his moment, patient in the way that only people who have spent time in situations where patience is the only available weapon ever get patient. Mr. Berube wanted me to pass along his condolences, also to mention that his offer is still on the table. Given circumstances, he's willing to be flexible on the terms. "Flexible how?" I said. "Well, there's obviously nothing left of the facility, but the research, the theoretical work, the documentation that still has value, to the right buyer." "We don't have documentation. The fire got most of it." Freddie nodded slowly. The smile didn't shift. "Mr. Berube is also interested in any, let's say, ancillary projects you might have going, ongoing research, field work." A pause precisely calculated. "This is nice property out here, private." I understood then what he was telling me, and what he was not saying, and the space between those two things was an implied threat clear enough that I didn't need it spelled out. They knew we were out here. They had been watching, or they had someone watching, or they had put together enough from the fire investigation, and our supply runs to know that 2 engineers who just lost their lab were still buying components and driving south every morning with equipment in the truck bed. "Tell Mr. Berube we appreciate his condolences," I said. "We're not interested in the offer." Freddie looked at the tree line behind me, a long look, the kind designed to communicate something, then back at me. "Think it over," he said. "We'll be in touch." They drove back up the logging road, and I stood in the red dirt until the sound of the engine faded entirely. And then I walked back into the trees to where Cabe was sitting with his back against a loblolly pine, watching. "Those are not government," he said. "No, private. There's a man who wants to own our research, has for a while." "They will return." "Yes." "With more people." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, not absent, but considering. I had come to understand that Cabe's silences had texture, the way weather has texture. This one had the quality of someone calculating variables. "You should know," he said, "that the transit beacon, once activated, will produce a pulse of a specific character. It will be detectable to anyone with appropriate monitoring equipment within a range of approximately 800 kilometers. It will also, in the moment of activation, produce an electromagnetic event of significant magnitude." "How significant?" "Comparable to what your device produced when it malfunctioned." I looked at him. "You're telling me the beacon is going to look, from the outside, like our reactor going off again?" "Structurally similar, yes." "And anyone who was interested in our reactor would be very interested in that." This is why I tell you now, rather than at the moment of activation. You require time to make decisions. 4 days left, I said. 3 days, 21 hours, he corrected, gently. I drove back through the pine flatlands that night and I called Jessie. She was at her mother's in Columbia, 16 years old, and she answered on the first ring because she always answered on the first ring when it was me. which was one of the facts about my daughter that I tried not to think about too hard because it tended to make me feel unworthy of it. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, Jess." I drove for a minute with nothing but road noise between us. "You good?" "I'm fine. Are you fine?" "I'm working on something." "The reactor." "Different project. Related." I paused. "I wanted you to know I'm working on it, in case the next few days get complicated." She was quiet the way teenagers are quiet when they're trying to decide whether to ask the real question. "Complicated how?" she said. "I'll explain after, I promise." "Dad." "Yeah." "Is it dangerous?" I thought about Freddie's smile and the way he'd looked at the tree line. I thought about Cabe in the hollow, burning his reserves one day at a time. I thought about 4 days and everything that could go wrong in 4 days, which was a long list with no end. "Some of it might get uncomfortable," I said, "but I've got Tom with me." She made a sound that was half exasperation and half something else. "Tom's not reassuring, Dad. Tom burned down the lab." "Tom and I burned down the lab." "You say that like it makes it better." "I love you, Jess." "I love you too." A pause. "Call me when it's done." "I will." I drove the rest of the way in silence. The next 2 days we worked without stopping except to sleep in short rotations. Tom had rigged a tarp shelter at the edge of the tree line, so we didn't have to carry components through the woods every morning, which helped, though it also meant we were living for 2 days on gas station sandwiches and coffee from a thermos that Tom had the foresight to bring, and that I owed him for. The beacon frame took shape in a clearing about 30 meters from where Cabe rested. It was nothing elegant welded steel framing, zip-tied bundles of cabling, the crystalline lattice suspended in a geometry that looked, to an untrained eye, like an abstract sculpture made by someone with an engineering degree and a head injury. To a trained eye, it looked like something that might actually work. Cabe watched us work when he had the energy for it. He communicated less as the days passed, not because he was closing off, but because the effort of maintaining the thought language cost him something. I had learned by then to read his silences, or had learned the edges of reading them, which was maybe the same thing. When I got something right in the fabrication, he had a stillness that felt like recognition. When I got something wrong, there was a faint tension, not critical, just present, that I'd learned to catch and correct before I had to ask. On the morning of the third-to-last day, I arrived at the site before Tom and found Berub's men there ahead of me. Not 3 this time, 6, and Freddie wasn't with them, which meant this was the step past the courtesy call. They were at the edge of the tree line, 2 of them with the shelter, and the other 4 fanned in a rough arc across the clearing. One of them was looking at the beacon frame with his phone out, taking photographs. They hadn't seen me come down from the logging road. I stood at the tree line on the far side and thought through my options, which were not good. I could go back for Tom. That would take time we didn't have and might not help. I could call the county sheriff. I had a relationship with the sheriff's office from the facility fire, not warm but functional. The problem was that explaining why I was out here, what I was building, and why Berub's private security should leave me alone was a conversation that would take the rest of the day and accomplish nothing useful. Or I could walk out of the trees and do the thing that had never once worked in my life, which was talk to people who had already made up their minds. I walked out. The men who'd been going through the shelter stopped. The one with the phone stopped photographing. Everyone went still in the specific way of men who have been trained to go still, and who are now assessing whether the situation requires the next step or the step after that. "This is private property," I said. "You're trespassing." The man who stepped forward wasn't Freddie. He was older, broader, with the kind of face that has had things happen to it. "Mr. Haas," he said, "you've been busy. I need you to leave." "We're not going to do that." He said it matter-of-factly, no heat in it. "Mr. Berub has significant interest in what you've built here. We're going to need you to walk us through it." I'm not going to do that. Mr. Hawes, I'm not going to do that, I said again, slower this time, because what you're looking at is not your property, and the research behind it is not your research, and the application it's intended for is not something you have any right to access or interfere with. And I want you to think very carefully about what I just said. The man tilted his head slightly. The application, he said. Yes. What is the application exactly? I looked at him. I made a decision. Some decisions you make the way you make calculations, by running the numbers. Some decisions you make because you are out of options and out of time, and the thing in your chest that has been a fishhook made of sound for the last 9 days tells you that this is the moment where you say the true thing, regardless of whether it helps. There is a member of another species 40 meters inside that tree line, I said. He is alive, and he is dying slowly in our atmosphere, and in approximately 60 hours he has a window to transmit a beacon signal that will bring a retrieval vessel to this location. This device is the beacon. It uses the same physics as the reactor we were building. If your employer interferes with it, a living being dies here on a Tuesday in October in a county that almost nobody has heard of, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure that somebody hears about it. Silence. The man with the broad, worn face looked at me for a long time. You're serious, he said. I'm serious. He looked at the tree line. He looked back at me. I need to make a phone call, he said. You can do that from the logging road. He looked at me again. He said something quiet to the men around him, and they didn't move immediately. But after another moment, he turned and walked toward the logging road. And after another moment, the others followed, and I stood in the clearing with my heart going at about twice its normal rate and watched them go. Tom arrived 20 minutes later, and I told him what had happened, and he was quiet for a moment. They'll be back, he said. I know. Before the window closes. I know. I picked up a coil assembly and carried it to the beacon frame, so we finished today. Martin, Tom said. Yeah. The readings from the test, before it blew. He was looking at the beacon frame with the expression he got when he was thinking about something he was having trouble saying. This is what we were after, isn't it? This is the physics. Him being here, what he showed you, this is what the reactor was trying to do. Functionally similar, yes. Tom was quiet for another moment. All right, he said. He picked up the other end of the assembly. Let's finish it. We worked through the afternoon and into the evening, rigging the power cells in their mounts, running the final calibration sequences on the coil arrays, aligning the lattice by hand because the instruments we had weren't precise enough for the final degree of tolerance. Cabe came out of the hollow for the first time in 2 days to observe the final assembly, moving slowly, and the sight of him in the late afternoon light, the gray-green of him, the way the iridescence moved across his skin when he shifted, the particular deliberateness of his movement, was something I won't try to describe better than that because any description I give will reduce it to something it wasn't. He examined the beacon for a long time. His hands moved over the frame without touching it, following the geometry, reading the arrangement of components. This will function, he said. The capacitance on the secondary array is off by a margin, I said. I know. It was as close as we could get with what we had. Within tolerance, he paused. There is something I want to tell you. Okay. The survey species I belong to has cataloged 1,142 inhabited worlds. In the course of 11 of your decades of work, I have made contact with 9 species at a stage of development broadly comparable to yours. He paused again, and I felt the deliberateness of what was coming the way you feel weather change. Of those 9, 4 were capable of what you did here. I didn't say anything. I do not mean the physics. The physics was evident the moment your device's pulse reached my vessel. I mean the rest of it, the decision to help, The willingness to carry the weight of it without certainty of outcome. The capacity to do that while afraid. He looked at me with those amber gold eyes, and I felt something arrive that wasn't a word but that I understood as clearly as any word I had ever heard. 4 of 9. That's not a lot, I said. No, he agreed, it is not. Tom was very busy with something on the opposite side of the beacon frame, and not looking at either of us, which was thoughtful of him. I thought about 4 of 9 for a long time that night, driving back. I thought about the other 5, the species that couldn't or didn't. I thought about what that looked like from the outside, whether it was fear or greed or something else entirely, some failure of imagination or nerve at the critical moment. I thought about whether there was a world in which I had turned around at the creek, walked back to the car, driven home and convinced myself the pull in my chest was a stress response, and the dream was just a dream. There was a world in which I had done exactly that. I'd been living in it for 9 days before I made a different choice. On the day before the beacon assembly was complete, Cabe told me something else he had been keeping. I had brought him water, and a specific mineral compound Tom had helped me identify from the biological data Cabe had shared in one of our early conversations. His body needed it and could absorb our version of it in small quantities, imperfectly but usefully. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. Cabe accepted it with the particular stillness that I had learned to read as gratitude, though I was aware that my reading of him was still imprecise and probably always would be. The survey organization, he said, when the retrieval vessel comes, there will be a record of this contact. Is that a problem? No, protocol, but you should understand what it means. A record of a voluntary first contact initiated by a pre-interstellar species under duress, resulting in successful cooperation, is not a common entry in the catalog. How uncommon. In 11 of your decades of my surveys, I have not produced one. He paused. In the organization's full history, there are 43 such records. Out of how many contacts? Thousands. I sat with that for a while. What happens to the 43? I said. The record is kept. The species is flagged for monitoring. Not intervention. We do not intervene in developmental trajectories, but attention. The understanding that something of potential significance is present. That sounds like being on a list. It is, in a sense, being on a list. Is it a good list? Cabe was quiet. I felt something move through the channel between us that was not a word, but that I understood clearly enough. An acknowledgement that notable is not the same as safe, and that the universe does not guarantee outcomes for any species regardless of what they've demonstrated. Right, I said. He looked at me. You are not afraid of that. I'm afraid of a lot of things, I said. That particular thing doesn't feel like mine to carry. The people coming back up the logging road, the 2-hour window, the 14-second transmission margin, those are mine. The long-term implications for the species, that's a problem for someone younger and better rested. A long pause. That is a very practical way to think about it, he said. I'm an engineer, I said. We work the problem in front of us. Berub's men came back at 11 that night. More of them this time. 8 vehicles on the logging road, headlights cutting through the pine trees, and I knew from the approach that the phone call had not gone the way the broad-faced man had hoped, and that we were past the stage of conversation. Tom and I were standing at the beacon when the lights came through the trees. Cabe was at the activation panel, a section of the beacon frame that his hands were the right shape to engage in the way ours weren't, and the window was 2 hours away by his reckoning. 2 hours was also not enough time to drive away and come back. We had already talked about this. How many? Tom said. A lot. Right, he looked at the beacon. What do we need? 2 hours of them not touching this equipment. Tom thought about it. I'll talk to them, he said. Tom. Martin, I did 3 tours as a Navy electrician. The most useful thing I learned was how to make men stand in a parking lot for 2 hours filling out forms. He took off his jacket and handed it to me. He had a grease stain on his forearm from the coupling work, and his regrowing eyebrows gave him a look that was slightly deranged in a way that I thought might actually work in our favor. Go stand next to your friend. Make sure nothing goes wrong with the machine. He walked toward the logging road. I walked to the beacon. Cabe watched Tom go. He is a good man, he said. Yes, I said, he's better than he looks. Better than I expected, Cabe said, which was the closest thing to a joke he had produced in 10 days, and I was grateful for it. I stood beside the beacon in the clearing and listened to Tom's voice carrying through the trees. Not the words, just the cadence, that steady authoritative flow that he could produce when he needed to. A voice that sounded like paperwork and procedure and the implicit weight of consequences. I listened to it, and I watched Cabe's hands at the activation panel, making small adjustments, and I watched the sky overhead go from black to something imperceptibly lighter than black as the hours moved. There was shouting at one point, Tom's voice and another voice, neither of them backing down, then Tom's voice alone for a long time, then quiet. 30 minutes from the window, 2 of Berub's men came through the tree line. Not the broad-faced man, younger ones, sent ahead, and I could see from the way they moved that they had been told to secure the equipment rather than to talk about it. I need you to step back from the device, one of them said. I didn't step back. Mr. Hawes stepped back. No, I said. Cabe did not look up from the panel. His hands continued their slow, precise work. There are 8 of us and 2 of you, the man said, and your friend is occupied. That's accurate, I said. I'm not stepping back. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment because I think it's important, and because I've thought about it many times since. I was afraid. I was tired in a way that went past the physical, down into something that doesn't have a good name. I had no guarantee that anything we'd built would work. I had no guarantee that the vessel Cabe expected would actually come, or come in time, or be able to retrieve him in the condition he was in. I had made a promise to a being I had met 10 days ago in a drainage hollow in Colleton County. A promise I had no business making and every reason to break. And I was standing beside a machine I'd built from salvaged components in a field in October with 2 men telling me to move, and I did not move. I don't know what that says about me. I've thought about it. I think it might just say that I am the particular kind of stubborn that comes from having failed at enough things that you stop being afraid of any individual failure and start being more afraid of quitting. You can stand here with me, I told the man, or you can go back to the road. But this device activates in 22 minutes, and there is nothing you can do about that without destroying it. And if you destroy it, you are going to have to explain to a very large number of very serious people exactly what was out here and why you made that choice. The man stared at me. What very serious people, he said. The kind, I said, that come when the beacon goes off. He didn't know what that meant. Neither did I, entirely. I was extrapolating from what Cabe had told me, that the transit beacon signal would bring a retrieval vessel, that the survey organization he belonged to would respond. I didn't know what that response looked like or how long it would take or what it would mean for the 2 humans standing in a field in South Carolina when it arrived. But I knew what Cabe had told me about 9 species and 4 of them. I held my ground. The man looked at his partner. The partner looked at me. They stood in the clearing and they didn't move and I didn't move and none of us moved for the 22 minutes that remained. The beacon activated at 1:47 in the morning on the 16th of October. I won't pretend I can describe the physics of what happened in any language that does it justice. The coil arrays came to resonance in a sequence I could follow by the sound, a low harmonic that climbed in frequency until it was past hearing, and then a feeling rather than a sound, a vibration in the chest and behind the eyes. The lattice glowed with a light that wasn't quite light, more like the idea of light in a frequency I didn't have receptors for, and the air around the beacon frame developed a quality of pressure that I felt in my sinuses and my back teeth. Cabe placed his hands on the activation surface, and the lattice pulsed once, hard, and the pulse went out. I felt it leave, not heard, felt, like a door opening in all directions at once and then closing. Then the clearing was just a clearing. The beacon frame was dark. The coil arrays ticked quietly as they cooled. Somewhere back on the logging road, Tom was still talking to men in black SUVs, because Tom Dillingham is the kind of man who can fill 2 hours with functional-sounding procedural discussion, even after the thing he was buying time for has already happened. Cabe lowered his hands. "Well," he said. "Well," I said. "Is it sufficient?" he said, and I understood he was asking whether I had kept my promise, whether what we'd built was enough. "I don't know yet," I said, "but it went." "Yes," he agreed, "it went." We sat in the clearing, him on the ground, me on an upturned crate, and we waited. The two of Berub's men who had come through the tree line were standing at the edge of it now, not closer, not farther. One of them had a phone to his ear. The other was looking at the sky. I looked at the sky too. The waiting was its own kind of work. 53 minutes is not a long time by most measures. It is a long time when you are sitting in a dark clearing in October with a being from somewhere you cannot name, and the whole weight of what might or might not be coming is distributed evenly across every second of it. I didn't talk much. Cabe didn't either. We had, in some sense, already said what needed saying, and the silence between us had a quality that I don't know how to describe except to say it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that accumulates between people, or between whatever we were to each other, who have done hard work together and are resting now, before the outcome arrives. I thought about the reactor, about the 15 tests, 14 of them successful at small scale, and the 15th that had torn the east wing off the building and sent a pulse into the sky. I thought about the fact that the 15th test had failed, and the 15th test had also, in the only way that ultimately mattered, worked. The pulse had gone out. The energy had been real. The principle had held, exactly as Tom had said, and the proof of it was sitting 3 feet away from me with his back against a pine tree, alive because an engineer in South Carolina had been ornery enough to follow a dream into the woods on a Tuesday. There is a thing that happens sometimes after a sustained crisis, where the body catches up with what the mind has been handling. I felt it then, a fatigue that went all the way down, past tired, into something quieter, something that was almost peaceful. I had built a machine that worked. I had kept a promise. Whatever came next was going to be complicated and long and probably expensive in ways I hadn't calculated yet, but the thing I had set out to do was done. I looked at Cabe. He was looking at the sky. His face was not easy to read, and I had gotten better at it over 10 days without becoming good at it, had something in it that I thought might be a kind of anticipation. Not anxiety, something older and quieter, the look of someone who has been away a very long time and is about to stop being away. "Will they come quickly?" I said, "once the beacon went?" He considered. The signal propagates at, the number he gave me was not in any reference frame I could use. Fast, he added, in a way that felt like a gentle accommodation. "How far away were they when you went down?" "Far, but I was overdue. They will have begun searching. The beacon narrows the search considerably." "Is this the kind of thing that happens to your surveyors often?" "Crashing? No," he paused. "The kind of thing that happens in the last half hour, yes. More often than you might expect. There are many species who want what a survey vessel represents. The technology, the access. Berube is a type. In our experience, Berube is the most common type." He thought for a moment. "What is uncommon is the other kind." "The other kind," I said. "The kind that helps." I didn't say anything to that. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, and then the sky changed, and the waiting was over. In 53 minutes, the retrieval vessel came. I'm not going to tell you what it looked like because what it looked like is not something I have the right language for, and because the official account that was eventually sanitized and classified contains a description that I am told is close enough. What I will tell you is that it was visible from the ground as a source of light that was not the moon and was not a star and was not an aircraft, and that it descended to an altitude that I estimated at a few hundred feet before holding position, and that its presence in the air above that clearing at 2:40 in the morning was the single most clarifying fact I have ever witnessed. Not frightening, clarifying. It took Cabe 4 minutes to reach the retrieval point. He moved slowly, but he moved without help, and when he reached the edge of the clearing he stopped and turned, and the amber gold of his eyes caught the light from above and held it. "Thank you," he said. It was the simplest arrival in my mind he had ever produced. No qualification, no context, no surrounding meaning, just that. "Get home," I said. He turned and walked into the light. I stood in the field with my hands in my jacket pockets, and I watched until there was nothing left to watch. Tom came through the trees a few minutes later, hands in his pockets too, and stood beside me. "Everybody on the road is on their phones," he said. "They stopped arguing about 20 minutes ago." "I know." He looked at the sky. The sky was just the sky again. "It worked," he said. "Yes." "The beacon, the physics," he was quiet, "it worked." "It worked." He breathed out slowly. "We're going to have a lot of explaining to do." "Yes, we are." "Federal level, probably." "Almost certainly." "They'll want the data, everything we documented." "Let them want it." I picked up my jacket from the ground where I'd set it down 9 hours earlier. "They can ask politely, same as anyone else." Tom almost smiled. "You figure Berub's people are still on the road." "I figure they're still on the road, wondering what they're going to say to their boss." "Good." He picked up the thermos from beside the crate and checked it. Empty. He set it back down. "You know what this means. The resonance work. What he confirmed that the physics is real. The reactor wasn't a failure." "It failed pretty catastrophically, Tom." "The test failed, the principle held." He looked at the beacon frame, dark and still now, looking like nothing in particular. "We were right, Martin." I stood in a clearing in Colleton County at 3 in the morning, with 8 of a petroleum magnate's private security still parked on my logging road, and the certainty that the next several months of my life would be a sustained negotiation with federal agencies about what I knew and what I'd done and what I was allowed to keep. I stood there and thought about Jessie and my promise to call her when it was done. "Yeah," I said, "we were right." I called her from the truck, sitting in the parking lot of the logging road turnoff, while Tom sat in the passenger seat with the empty thermos on his lap, and the first gray light of the morning came up through the windshield. She answered on the first ring. "Dad." "It's done," I said. A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm tired, I'm okay." "What happened?" "I'll tell you. Not on the phone. Come to Walterboro for the weekend and I'll tell you everything." Another pause, longer. I could hear her processing the weight of what I wasn't saying. "Did it work?" she said. "Whatever you were doing, did it work?" I looked at the sky, which was just the sky again, pink at the edge, dark overhead, the last stars fading. The ordinary sky of a county that almost nobody had heard of, on a morning that looked exactly like any other morning. "Yeah," I said, "it worked." The months that followed were what I'd predicted, and worse in some specific ways and better in others. The federal engagement was swift and total, 3 agencies, one after another, and then a joint task force that didn't have a public name and whose representatives all had the same flat professional affect that told you they had spent time in rooms where very strange things had been discussed with very straight faces. I told them what happened. I told them all of it, which was the decision I had made in the truck that morning, that the attempt to hold anything back would cost more than the telling. What I told them went into reports that went into files that went into a process I was not part of and was not briefed on, and had no meaningful influence over. Tom handled the legal side of things, which he was better at than I was, and which he approached with the same implacable patience he'd brought to keeping Berub's men on the logging road for 2 hours. Berube himself mounted a counter-narrative that we had been conducting unauthorized experiments on private land, that the energy discharge had been reckless, that the whole thing was a fabrication. The 3 civil suits that followed did not go well for him. I don't know exactly why, but I have some theories, and those theories involve the kind of institutional weight that can be applied when people with no public name decide to apply it. Jessie came to Walterboro that weekend. We sat on the porch of the house I'd been renting since the divorce, and I told her the whole thing, start to finish, without leaving any of it out. She was 17 by then, a year closer to the age where you can hear the full weight of something without needing it softened. She listened the way she had always listened, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on my face, and when I finished she was quiet for a while. 4 out of 9, she said. That's what he told me. That's not very many. No. She looked out at the yard. The pine trees at the edge of the property shifted in a light wind. What do you think the other 5 did? She said. I don't know, I didn't ask. Why not? I thought about it. Because it didn't matter, I said. What they did or didn't do, that wasn't the problem I was working. My problem was getting him home. She thought about that for a while. Dad, she said. Yeah. You know what I think. Tell me. I think you always talk about yourself like you're someone who fails at things, she said. Like that's just what you are, but I don't think that's true. I think you're someone who keeps trying past the point where most people would stop. That's different. I looked at my daughter, who was 17 years old and smarter than I deserved. Maybe, I said. Not maybe. She leaned her head against my shoulder briefly, the way she'd done when she was small. 4 out of 9, Dad, you were one of the 4. I've thought a lot in the years since about what Cabe said. 1,142 inhabited worlds. 9 species at a stage comparable to ours. 4 of those 9 capable of what we did. I don't know what the standard is. I don't know what he was measuring exactly. I don't know if 4 is a good number or a discouraging one or just a number. What I know is that on a Tuesday in October, a man who had failed at enough things to stop counting stood in a drainage hollow and made a promise to a stranger from somewhere else entirely, and then kept the promise. Not because he was brave, not because he'd calculated the odds, because something had pulled at his chest like a fishhook made of sound, and he'd followed it out to the edge of his own life, and found someone on the other side who needed exactly what he happened to have. I drive the 40 minutes in every morning. I stand in what's left of the facility, or sometimes I walk the tree line, or sometimes I go out to the creek bed and stand at the bend and listen to the water. Tom and I rebuilt the lab. Different building, better containment, actual funding now not from Berube, who lost 3 civil suits in the following year, but from sources that asked fewer questions about applications and more questions about principles, which is the way research is supposed to work. The reactor is not finished. It will take more time, but the math still works. The simulations still work. And we know now that the physics is real, because someone from 1,142 worlds away built a working device from the same principles and used it to go home. I'm not a religious man. I'm an engineer. But there are mornings when the light comes through the pine canopy at a certain angle, and I think about 4 of 9, and I think about what it means that of all the things you can be in this universe, one of the things you can be is the kind of species that keeps its promises to strangers. I think about what it would mean to be otherwise. And then I go to work.